that'll be okay. All right, so we're going to start with Pinot Noir. What is it? Okay, well, good question. And we'll start with the basics. Pinot Noir is a red variety of Vitis vinifera, which is the species of grape that we are typically talking about when we talk about fine wine. There's a number of different species of the Vitis family, or genus, I should say, but most of them are not necessarily, don't make particularly great wine. There are some exceptions, but when we're talking about fine wine, we're almost exclusively talking about Vitis vinifera or potentially hybrids thereof. The origins of Pinot Noir are in Burgundy in France. We'll talk a little more about the history there in a moment. But the history, as far as we can tell, seems to go back about 2,000 years, possibly longer. That's just kind of when we have the first real records that are verifiable for the cultivation of this variety. And that makes it one of the oldest known varieties that is still cultivated in the world. And that is relevant in a few different ways that I will talk about in a little bit. Interestingly, despite the origins of the wine in France, there's actually more Pinot Noir planted in the United States now than in France, largely in California and Oregon, and that's where we'll be focusing in our class today. France, California, and Oregon. That isn't to say that there aren't some other great sources of Pinot Noir out there. Germany, New Zealand, Italy, Australia, Chile, and plenty of other countries produce world-class expressions, but this is a 30-minute class, so I have to kind of keep it short. And unsurprisingly, especially in those countries, the grape can go by a variety of different names. They're kind of listed here. There are more synonyms for it out there, but these are the ones that you might encounter on a rare occasion on a label. All right. Why do we care about Pinot Noir? Well, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about why we care about wine. I assume if you're here watching this, attending this class, you care at least a little bit about wine. Or I have induced you to attend, in which case, thank you. But for the most part, the reason we care about Pinot Noir in particular is that it seems to be, among the varieties that we cultivate, one of the best at expressing what is a very French concept, the idea of terroir. And I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds trying to explain to you what terroir means, in part because it doesn't really translate super well. But the idea is essentially that through a finished product, i.e. this bottle of wine, we can in some way understand the conditions in a vineyard in a given vintage. So one year, one place, often one variety, but sometimes multiple varieties blended together. And that Pinot Noir just seems to show more variation over the course of years, over the course of, or in different conditions, in different places, not just in France versus in the United States, but even in fairly, neighboring vineyards in villages in parts of France and also in California and in Oregon. And at its best, the Pinot Noir can produce wines of really remarkable complexity. A great Pinot Noir should offer you a lot of aromatics, both fruit notes, but also things like spices and occasionally things like dried flower petals, mushrooms, all that kind of stuff. At its worst, it's just kind of fruit. And there's plenty of examples, unfortunately, of I think, not remarkable Pinot Noir. As it's become more and more popular, it's been more and more widely planted, and that means that there are going to be examples of Pinot Noir that sadly don't do the name and the grape very much justice. A little bit about the grape. I'm not going to go too deep into any of this, but basically, and it's only important as we talk about how it really expresses itself in the glass in a moment, but Pinot Noir is a thin-skinned variety, meaning that, and I don't know how great the color will be here, but if you look at my glass, and this is granted a little bit older, as an 8-year-old Pinot Noir from France, the wine's never going to have a whole lot of color. It's especially not going to have that sort of deep purple, violet hue that we sometimes associate with red wine. It's also not going to have a whole lot of tannins typically, although there are exceptions, and I'll talk about tannins here in a moment. It also both buds and ripens early, meaning that it starts its sort of maturation process in the given year on the early side and also ends it early, which is good and bad depending on where you are. And it's one of the things about Pinot Noir that's challenging is it's just in general a somewhat finicky variety. And that's one of the reasons why it is both loved and hated by grape growers and winemakers. They love the potential for making exceptional wine. Everything up until that point is really, really tough. There's also been a general consensus or belief out there that the variety is more prone to mutations, but we don't really know because, as I mentioned before, Pinot Noir has been cultivated so long that a lot of the differences that we find from clone to clone, and I'm not going to get into too much of this, but basically it may be the case that that diversity is more about just the fact that we as humans have been cultivating it for so long. It may not mutate any more regularly than Cabernet Sauvignon or Chardonnay, but we've just been cultivating it so long that those successful clones have had more opportunities to spread and differentiate themselves. That said, there are lots and lots of named clones that fall into a bunch of different categories. The only ones at the moment that I would say you should even keep an eye out for or pay any attention to are the Dijon and Pommard clones, which are correlated with cities or towns in Burgundy and come from vineyards in that area or were first identified in that area. There's the Wädenswil clone, which is a Swiss clone, but is prominent in Oregon. And then there are these sort of clones that are originally French, but have taken on their own kind of life in California, and to some extent have then been planted in Oregon and other parts of the US and occasionally other parts of the world. Generally speaking, what we're talking about when we're drinking and looking at a glass of Pinot Noir. So the visual component to start out with, as I mentioned, we're going to get much more red or even potentially orange or brown hue with age than we are purple. And the color is always going to be a little bit of a delicate thing. If you get an ink black Pinot Noir, something has gone wrong. Either you have gotten something that's not Pinot Noir, or some unscrupulous producer has added basically wine concentrate to give you that color, because Pinot just will never do that. On the nose, the aromatics of the wine, you're going to get a sort of a range of mostly red fruit notes that can range from sort of tart, underripe, which you might find more commonly in Burgundy, to really ripe, luscious cherry, strawberry, raspberry, even occasionally something like black cherry or plum in warmer climate Pinot Noir or from really warm vintages in Burgundy. Again, I mentioned these sort of combination of spices, mushrooms, this sort of potpourri or dried flower notes. And then Pinot Noir is often, but not always, aged in oak barrels. And those can often give you a sort of combination of vanilla, cinnamon, other baking spices that can interplay really nicely with this fruit profile in these aromatics, or sometimes can really overpower them. And it's one of the challenges for winemakers is finding that balance. As far as what the wine tastes like, you'll often find a similar fruit profile on the palate. But again, the wine is at its essence on the delicate side. So a more thin to moderate body. That body can sometimes be enhanced a little bit with oak. It can add a little bit of weight. As I mentioned, you're not going to get a ton of tannin, that sort of astringent, mouth-drying characteristic that some red wines can certainly have. And it's one of the reasons why I think Pinot Noir has become so popular, is that it offers a lot of interesting characteristics in the glass without a lot of tannin. And many, although certainly not all, of the more aromatically and sort of flavor intense wines that are out there do tend to be a little more tannic. So Pinot offers an alternative. And then it will have a sort of moderate to high level of acidity, that sort of mouth-watering characteristic that wine has as, an acidic beverage. Wine is all acidic. It's just kind of a question of how much. So as I mentioned, the story of Pinot Noir begins in Burgundy, which for those of you who are not familiar with France is this sort of reddish hued area here. But Pinot Noir is grown in much of the eastern part of France, in the nearby Jura, to some extent in the Savoie down here in these sort of alpine regions, and then, of course, has spread to neighboring countries, Italy, Switzerland, Germany in particular. Like I said, we don't know exactly where the grape originates or even its parentage, which is, again, because it's so old, that it's possible that Pinot Noir was actually a wild variety that was cultivated. Most grape varieties that we work with are sometimes many generations descended from a wild grapevine, but Pinot Noir might be itself a wild cultivar. We don't know. The first really clear evidence of winemaking of Pinot Noir in Burgundy dates to 312 of the Common Era, but the odds are very, very good that it was cultivated for centuries or even potentially a millennia before that. A little more history. I love history, and especially as it relates to wine. If you take more classes with me, you will get used to these slides that have a lot of history on them, because I think it's fascinating. And one of the things that I love about wine is it's a way to look into history that to me is extremely relevant, and yet also you can pay as much or as little attention to it as you want. You can still love the wine and know absolutely nothing about how it came to be. But basically, there's these sort of two orders of monks in France, the Benedictines and the Cistercians, both of which are based in and around Burgundy during the sort of after the fall of the Roman Empire. And both of them were very interested in viticulture and the production of wine, and were involved in planting and more than just planting, really cataloging vineyards and sort of separating out the better vineyards from the lesser vineyards and starting to create a hierarchy that still persists in France to this day. And we'll come to this in just a moment. The independence of, or near independence of the Burgundy region under the Valois dukes in the late 1300s also was really important in sort of creating this identity of Burgundy as a place. And then after the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era, you have a sort of a set of inheritance laws that still essentially exist in France today, where land and other property is sort of split evenly among all sons, as opposed to previously where it would always go to the oldest. So you have a real fracturing of vineyard holdings in Burgundy, because after the revolution, all that land was essentially given to farmers as opposed to being previously controlled by the king or by the church. Here's a little more look at the maps. So there are sort of these two major, as far as the great vineyards and great wines of Burgundy, and again, this is a bit of an oversimplification, I apologize. There are the two main parts of Burgundy, the Côte de Nuit to the north and the Côte de Beaune to the south. The Côte de Nuit is better known for Pinot Noir, but it's planted throughout both parts of what's called the Côte d'Or. And we'll talk a little more about some of these villages right now, or just in a moment, I should say, in the Côte de Nuit in particular. One last thing to understand about Burgundy is it's this whole idea of the sort of pyramid that we talk about. So as you can see at the base of the pyramid, there are the sort of just regional wines, Bourgogne Rouge, Bourgogne Blanc, basically red wine from Burgundy and white wine from Burgundy. And then there are all the various villages that we saw on this previous screen here. Oops, sorry, let me go back. That each have their own name. And so if the wine comes from the vineyards in that village, you can append that, you can put that individual village name on the label. Some of the villages are more highly prized and certainly more expensive than compared to others. And then there are the Premier and Grand Cru wines. The Premier Cru wines are, again, attached to single villages. The Grand Cru wines are actually their own independent appellations, every last one of the 33 Grand Cru appellations. And speaking of, since we're talking about it, let's look at this list a little bit. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically there are, like I said, 33 Grand Cru vineyards, not all of which are dedicated to red wine production. Some of them are dedicated exclusively to white wine production, and a few of them are shared between both red and white wine. But again, mainly in the Côte de Nuit. And so the most famous vineyards are often actually now attached to the name of the village. So the village was of Gevrey at one point decided, well, the most famous thing that comes out of Gevrey is wine from Chambertin. So we're going to call our village Gevrey Chambertin, because then everyone will know exactly what we're talking about. And you can see that this trend exists for a lot of these villages. That isn't to say that only those villages in the Côte de Nuit are good sources. You can actually find great wines from in the Côte de Beaune, like the one I am drinking, which is from Volnay, Volnay-Saint-Denis, which is a Premier Cru vineyard down there. But it is also the case that if we're talking about the absolute, what are considered the finest expressions of Pinot Noir in the world, many of them do come from these Grand Cru vineyards. But as things change, as the world evolves, as climate change takes its toll, it may be the case that where these Grand Cru vineyards are sited, which is typically the warmest parts of a relatively cool region, may actually be less, you might see equal to or better wine coming out of some of these lesser regarded villages like Pommard, Volnay, or Mercury. Moving forward. So what do we know? Okay, so an important thing to take note of as we move forward in this class, and as you move forward in understanding Pinot Noir, is that Burgundy not only gave the world Pinot Noir, but and Chardonnay, it gave the world the idea of tying a wine to a very specific place. And I'll just very briefly contrast this with Bordeaux, the other most famous wine region in France. In Bordeaux, the identity is with the winery. the winemaker. If you are one of the 5 Premier Cru or first growth producers in Bordeaux, basically your name is what matters. You know, your estate is what matters, but it's not the vineyards itself. If you bring other vineyards into the fold, you buy them essentially, those are all now, you can make wine from those vineyards. It doesn't really matter. In Burgundy, the attachment is always to the place. So you have some examples in these Grand Cru vineyards of wineries or individual growers having a row or 2 of vines, and they might make 100 bottles of a Grand Cru wine. But because their vines are in that vineyard, in that named Grand Cru appellated vineyard, they can put that Grand Cru appellation on their wine, and they can do whatever they want with it. They can sell it, they can drink it, they can give it away. And it doesn't matter their legacy or their reputation. The vineyard is what matters. Now, there's some real positives to that being exported around the world, namely that it's caused a lot of producers, not just of Pinot Noir, but of a lot of varieties, to focus on trying to identify the absolute best sites for growing whatever it is they're growing, and then really focusing on identifying those vineyards. The downside is it's also led to a trend where you can kind of put any name on a bottle and people think it's fancier. This is a problem, especially in places like the US, but it's not exclusively a problem in the United States, I can tell you that. And the other issue is there is kind of this other idea of, you know, is it true that either Pinot Noir is the most noble variety? Debatable. It's certainly not the right variety to grow everywhere in the world. And even in a lot of places, is it really true that, say, in the Willamette Valley in Oregon, that so much vineyard land should be dedicated to one grape? Now, it is that way because it's what's become popular, what's been identified with, and frankly, it's what can generate the most revenue, can sell for the most. But it's also the case that sometimes we have ended up in a problem, again, not just in the US, in the whole world of wine, where we have fixated on a single variety in a place because it's either traditional or it's what has had success in a marketplace or whatever. And it's because of that tying a place and a grape so tightly together, we may kind of cut off possibilities for really interesting expressions of other varieties in a place because it's all been planted to the thing that we are most familiar with. Anyhow, to talk a little bit about more of that export of Pinot Noir, for a long time, I would say Pinot Noir was not the golden child it is now. It always had a following, but the wines, as I've mentioned, tend to be on the delicate side. That was even more the case in the past with both cooler weather in some cases, but also just less technological and just sort of industry savvy about how to make wines, how to get a little bit more color, a little bit more depth in the wines. So it kind of held Pinot Noir and Burgundy as a region back. But you start to see this changing as essentially through a number of different historical moments. I'm not going to get into all of them here, but I will mention, because it's hugely important here in the US, the movie Sideways. I did a Merlot class a couple weeks ago, and Sideways was the villain in that class. Here, I guess it could be the hero, in that it really propelled Pinot Noir in this country, and especially domestic Pinot Noir, to a place of prominence, as illustrated by this graph here. So it's small, I apologize, the font, you can't really read it. But what's important to note is this is a graphing of Merlot and Pinot Noir tonnage, whoops, sorry, I went too far there, in California. And the really tall purple bars are Merlot tons, and you can see in 2005, so the year after the movie is released, it peaks and then starts to fall off, and the sort of teal line here, which is Pinot Noir tonnage in California, unsurprisingly, starts to take off immediately after the movie comes out and is now surpassed Merlot in terms of tonnage, which would have seemed unthinkable 20 years ago. In the United States, Pinot first arrives in California in the 1800s, mid-1800s, we think. We don't have, again, super great records. The most famous vineyard planted in the 1800s is Inglenook in 1880. But Pinot doesn't really start to find a home in terms of a single variety wine until the 1940s, when you have these 3 major plantings. Louis M. Martini, still a recognized label, planting in Sonoma County. You have the Chalone Vineyard planted in the Monterey County and Mount Eden as well. And then you have in the mid-1960s, 1966, David Lett plants Pinot Noir in the Willamette Valley, followed shortly thereafter within the next year by a couple of other producers who start to plant Pinot Noir there. And the 60s to 70s is sort of this huge growth of Pinot Noir plantings in California. Sonoma, Lake County, Anderson Valley, Santa Rita Hills, Russian River Valley, Santa Cruz Mountains, Monterey, etc. Basically everywhere, pretty much everywhere where Pinot is grown to great quality these days in California was planted, well, not everywhere. A few places were planted before the 60s to 70s, but many of the major plantings happened then. And those are now many of our most cherished Pinot Noir vineyards in the US. Oops, I skipped over California. Whoopsie. So here's again a map of California. This is Sonoma County specifically here, because many of the important appellations for Pinot Noir are contained within it. The one thing I will note here is you have a real divergence from what we're thinking of as these sort of coastal appellations, principally the Sonoma Coast appellation, and to some extent the Petaluma Gap, where you're really, in some cases in the Sonoma Coast, you're really essentially right on the ocean. When contrasted against the slightly more protected, more mild climates further inland, so in the Sonoma Valley proper over here, even in the Russian River Valley here, you're having a little more protection from the harshest elements of the Pacific. I will say that the Sonoma Coast is a really fascinating place for Pinot. It's a relatively new appellation in the country, and it is some of my favorite Pinot Noirs from California do come from there. It is, if you ever go out there, which I've had the chance to do a little bit, you are struck by how miserable a place it seems to kind of grow grapes. It's like very cold, very gray. You know, everything has like salt on it. It's rugged out there. You know, that part of the North California coast is not, you know, it's not sunny, warm California the way we typically think of it. But it does seem to make for awesome Pinot Noir. As you move further down the coast into the Central Coast area, you get to the Monterey County, which contains all these AVAs within it, as well as San Luis Obispo and Santa Barbara. There are others, but again, just a brief overview. And California, and we'll talk in a moment about kind of comparing Burgundy, California, and Oregon Pinot Noirs in the glass. Obviously, I'm going to make some really broad generalizations. I apologize, but again, trying to kind of give you some useful information. We can talk details later. So now we have the Willamette Valley here in Oregon. So the Willamette Valley is kind of wedged between the Cascade Mountains to the east and the coastal range to the west. So you get a little bit of ocean influence in the way that you do in a lot of California, not as much as you would get, say, again, in the Sonoma Coast, but you also are a little bit protected from some of the coolest weather, which is good because you're quite a bit further north in Oregon, of course. The Willamette River also flows through here, which provides some moisture and its own kind of influence. There's a big mixture of soil types, and again, when in my longer classes, I do dive into soil a little bit more. We're just going to kind of skip over it here. You can read along if you want. An important thing to note, though, in particular in Oregon, in the Willamette Valley, is basically everywhere you're looking at Pinot Noir growing, you're looking at it grown on a hillside. That has to do with the fact that because of the soils in the valley floor and the presence of the river, it's really fertile. I mean, the Willamette Valley floor is dedicated to production of things that are much more water intensive and nutrient intensive than grapes. And so you need to kind of go up the slopes a little bit to get away from that really fertile soil to be able to cultivate really great vines. And also to get a little bit above the potential fog line that you can have problems with, especially kind of the beginning and the end of the growing season. And the Willamette Valley is definitely a distinct region producing Pinot Noirs that have some similarities to both California and to Burgundy, but are their own thing as well. So to compare the three categories really generally, I would say that you're generally going to get the least ripe, the most tart characteristic of fruit in Burgundy. California, and again, gross generalization here, you will find a little bit more ripe, softer fruit character, often more on the red side than any kind of black fruit, which you'll find more often in Oregon. But again, this can hugely depend on site. If you find places like in the Sonoma Coast or other parts in the northern coast area that are really cool and promote a sort of more Burgundian style, that's also certainly possible. You also actually get less sunlight during the growing season because you're at a lower latitude than you do in either Burgundy or the Willamette Valley, which again, I think leads to these sort of slightly softer styles of Pinot Noir. And in the Willamette, as again, you get a little more of this dark fruit profile, sometimes like black cherry and plum. The wines also can be a little more tannic than you find in California or even potentially in Burgundy. But they do also tend to lean into this a little more Burgundian profile in terms of these mushroomy, savory notes that are a little bit harder to find in California. Not impossible, of course, but just a little bit less common. All are great. I won't pick a favorite. Please don't ask. Although I will say, for the sake of this class, I am drinking Burgundy today, but that's just because it's the first thing I grabbed. Couple more things about this before we wrap up here. So I think there was a question in chat, and I will answer it more fully, but there's this question about Pinot Noir and aging. So I believe that there is a mistaken belief out there that Pinot Noir is a variety that should age for a really long time. Now look, don't get me wrong, there are some examples out there that will disprove this point, but I think even with a lot of great Pinot Noir, I wouldn't go much past 10 years in terms of aging it. I just find that Pinot Noir's delicacy can turn into frailty with more age. You know, the wines can often be not super fruit driven in the first place, and since as wine ages, the sort of first thing that tends to diminish over time is that sense of fruit, that we really just kind of lose what makes Pinot Noir remarkable if you go too long. I've, privileged, I guess, to try some older Pinot Noirs, and I've yet to have a really remarkable experience. I mean, they can be kind of interesting, but they're just not, I haven't found them super pleasurable. So like I said, I think I wouldn't go much past 10 years with Pinot Noir unless you just love old wine and love really kind of delicate wine. And I think, frankly, with wine in general, my advice is I'd always rather drink it a little young and fully enjoy it than find out that I've waited too long and be disappointed that I waited that long. As far as the proper glassware, I mean, I have a Pinot Noir glass literally because it was a wedding present. I wouldn't otherwise buy them personally. I think the only thing to be aware of is with any aromatic variety, whether it's white or red, you want to give yourself a glass with enough volume that you can really swirl the wine, that you can allow the aromatics to release as they contact the air. So you don't want to drink this I wouldn't drink good Pinot Noir out of a rocks glass or out of, something along those lines. But I think, any old wine glass, as long as it's not too tiny, is probably good enough. If you want the fancy glasses, because, why not? That's cool too. I mean, like I said, I use it, but I wouldn't go crazy over it. And then as far as serving temperature and decanting, two last pieces of service, I would say that I like my Pinot Noir to be cool, maybe a little cooler than some other varieties. We talk about sort of cellar temperature sometimes. I would say 60 degrees Fahrenheit is a nice temp. It can be a little warmer, a little cooler. But you don't want your wine to be fully room temp, at least when you first taste it. If it warms up a little bit over time, especially because we're in the middle of summer now, in most places it's going to be warmer than 60 degrees in your house, unless you got that AC cranked. But that's okay. But I'd like to start out at least a little bit cooler, and that just allows for the impression of the fruitiness of the wine to be a little less overt. It gives you a little more balance when you first taste it. And then again, if it warms up a little bit, that's just fine. As far as decanting goes, I don't typically bother with Pinot Noir. I mostly save my decanting for tannic varieties, so I don't think it's necessary. With an older bottle, you might get a little bit of sediment, so decanting can be useful in that sense, but I don't typically bother. Last couple things, just some ideas on pairings. Pinot generally likes sort of earthier, especially when you're talking about an earthier Pinot Noir, like root vegetables, mushrooms. It also does well with salmon, which can be a little bit tricky for a lot of things, or even tuna, especially if you're doing something like seared. You can certainly do it with red meat as well. I tend to find that it does better with leaner red meats. Really fatty meat in general needs typically a wine with more tannin. But the last thing I will say about pairing is it's good to think about complexity in food and wine. And sometimes you can do really well with matching a really complex wine and really complex food. But to me, Pinot is actually at its best when you kind of you oppose the food or wine in that sense. So if you have a really complex dish, I might look at a kind of more simple Pinot Noir. It'll give you a little bit of that earthy character, some of that fruit, but it's not going to demand your attention, which is great because if you have a really complex dish, you might want to focus on that. Conversely, with a really complex Pinot Noir, really great wine that you may have been saving, or something that someone gifted to you, or just you've just fallen out and you want an expensive bottle of Pinot Noir, I might, in that case, look for something really simple to serve with it, like just a little bit of grilled salmon and some wild rice or something. Like, you don't have to go crazy because the wine should hopefully deliver all this flavor and aroma and intrigue. And the food is there. I mean, you want to eat something generally, and it can be delicious, but you don't need a lot of flavors or components to a dish to work really well with a complex Pinot. Okay, so last thoughts, and then as I mentioned at the beginning, I would be happy to get to any and all questions you've got. I will stick around. You don't all have to, But basically, what I would say is that as far as Pinot Noir, it's complicated. This is a 30-minute class. Didn't get into everything. Apologize. But Pinot Noir is something that people spend their entire lives obsessing over. And I don't totally blame them. There's a lot to learn there. You can memorize individual vineyards in Burgundy and clones, and you can memorize history and all that. But I do think it's important to kind of understand, and I'll just finish with this thought, that what are you paying for when you buy a bottle of Pinot Noir? Well, you might be paying for a few different things. For one, as I mentioned, it's difficult to grow. So you're paying for labor in a lot of cases. It might be aged in a fair amount of new oak barrels. So you're paying for oak. And you're paying for oftentimes specificity. The wine may come from a really, really small vineyard. It might be a very small production wine. And there just isn't that much of it out there. And it's often in high demand. So you may be paying for that exclusivity as well. Lastly, unfortunately, you might be paying for trendiness, and you might be paying for essentially marketing. And that's an important thing to be aware of. There's unfortunately a lot of expensive Pinot Noir out there from all over the world that trades on the fact that people associate Pinot Noir with great wine, and they may not be making great wine. And I wish I could offer you a clear-cut way to say, oh, don't spend your money. I think my only tip in that regard is, if you see the name of a vineyard on a wine and you go, maybe you decide to Google that vineyard, and the only winery making a wine from that vineyard that's where the name is on the label is the one that you bought or you're thinking about buying, that could be a red flag. Because typically great vineyards, whether they're in Burgundy or in the US or in any other part of the world, it's unlikely that the only winery that's highlighting that vineyard name is the one that you're buying, if that's a great vineyard. Now, there are exceptions, again, like everything I've said, but to me, that's a good starting point. And I'd be happy to answer more questions about that if you have them. Anyhow, I want to thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. Hopefully you enjoyed. Hopefully you're enjoying whatever Pinot Noirs you've got. I know some people mentioned in the chat what they're drinking. If you want to throw in what you're drinking there too, that'd be cool to see. If you're interested in what I'm doing in these classes, you can see on the screen, on the slide here, upcoming classes I have. And you can go to disgorgedwine.com. If you're interested in purchasing any classes, you can use the promo code Pinot when you check out, save $5, which is nice. Who couldn't use $5? And yeah, like I said, I'm going to go now open up chat. We're going to close this.